Okay, right now, at this exact moment, somewhere in America, a restaurant server just got their paycheck. And on that check, their employer legally paid them $2.13 per hour. Not 213, $2.13. That number has not changed, not one single penny, since 1991. And here's the part that messes with your head. Most people don't know that's even legal. They think they're leaving a tip as a bonus, a great job, buddy kind of gesture. But in reality, they're paying that worker's base salary. The employer gets a free pass. And the entire system, this exact arrangement, was engineered on purpose. And its roots go all the way back to slavery. So buckle up, because this is one of those stories where the more you dig, the darker it gets. Let's start with a number that honestly sounds made up. $50 billion. That is, roughly, how much Americans hand over in tips every single year. $50 billion. That's bigger than the GDP of a bunch of entire countries. And a massive chunk of that money? It's not a bonus on top of a fair wage. It is the wage. Here's how the system actually works. The federal minimum wage for most American workers sits at $7.25 an hour, which, let's be honest, is already not exactly living your best life money. But for workers who receive tips, their employer's federal obligation legally drops, to $2.13 per hour. That's the tipped minimum wage. And it's been locked at that number since 1991. George H.W. Bush was president. The Soviet Union still existed. Nevermind by Nirvana hadn't even come out yet. And that number? Completely unchanged. Now, technically, if a worker's tips plus their $2.13 base don't add up to at least $7.25 an hour, the employer is supposed to make up the difference. That's the law, in theory. In practice, wage theft in the restaurant and hospitality industry is rampant, and a lot of workers just don't get that difference covered. They absorb the gap, and nobody's really watching. So what you actually have is a system where the customer, that's you, that's me, is essentially functioning as a co-employer. You're subsidizing the worker's wage on behalf of a business that is legally off the hook for paying it, and the business keeps more of the revenue. And we've all been trained very effectively to think of this as manners. Oh, actually, hold on a second. Before we dive into the real origin story, I genuinely want to know, did you already know the tipped minimum wage was $2.13 an hour? Drop a yes or no in the comments right now, because I bring this up to people constantly, and the reaction is almost always the same. Total disbelief. Let me know where you land. All right, travel with me. It's somewhere in medieval England. We're talking around the 1400s or 1500s. The entire social structure of European life is built on one very simple, very brutal premise. Some people are lords and some people are servants. That's the deal. That's the contract. That's existence. If you're wealthy, and we're talking castle-owning, everybody bow down, I have a coat of arms wealthy, you have household servants. And those servants work for essentially nothing. Their compensation is food, a place to sleep, and the privilege of continuing to exist in your proximity, which honestly sounds like a terrible employment package. But occasionally, when a servant did something genuinely impressive, you'd press a coin into their hand. This was called giving Vails. It was noblesse oblige. Basically, I'm demonstrating my generosity because I'm powerful enough to be generous. It had almost nothing to do with service quality. It was about the tipper's social status. By the 1700s in England, this had become so common that guests visiting aristocratic households were expected to tip the servants before leaving. It was etiquette, a social ritual. Miss it, and you were considered cheap, or worse, common. Now here's where America enters the picture. For most of the 1800s, Americans hated tipping. Why? Because it felt deeply un-American. The whole premise of tipping was European aristocracy, a master class with money and a servant class dependent on their charity. America wasn't supposed to work that way. Land of the free, all men created equal. Tipping felt like cosplaying as European royalty, which for a young democracy was kind of an insult. The resistance got so strong that between 1909 and 1915, 7 states, Washington, Mississippi, Arkansas, Iowa, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, passed laws actually banning tipping. In Washington state, giving and receiving a tip was a misdemeanor. In Iowa, accepting a tip could get you thrown in jail for up to 30 days. And by 1926, every single one of those laws had been repealed. Not because people changed their minds, but because tipping had spread so fast, so completely, that it was basically impossible to enforce. Something had happened. Something had fundamentally changed. And that something was a train. We need to talk about a man named George Pullman. And to be completely real with you, this is the part most history books either skip entirely or bury in a footnote. It's 1867. The Civil War ended 2 years earlier. Slavery has been abolished, and millions of formerly enslaved Black Americans are suddenly, technically, free. But with no money, no property, no land, no legal protections, and very few job options. The South is in economic chaos. Racial violence is rampant. The promises of Reconstruction are already being undermined at every level. And in Chicago, a businessman named George Pullman is watching all of this, and he sees an opportunity. Pullman had built a luxury railroad sleeping car company, essentially hotels on wheels. The Pullman cars were the height of American sophistication. Wealthy passengers traveling cross-country could sleep in actual beds, eat fine meals, have their shoes shined. It was like a first-class airline experience, except on a train in the 1800s. So Pullman began hiring formerly enslaved Black men as porters, and he was explicit about his reasoning. He specifically chose men who had lived through slavery because, and he actually said this, they had received what he called perfect training to anticipate and cater to white passengers' every need. They would be, in his words, properly humble. These men became the Pullman Porters, and by the 1920s, the Pullman Company employed over 20,000 African American men, making it the single largest employer of Black workers in the entire United States. 20,000 people, one company, one labor model, built entirely around tips. The conditions were brutal. Pullman demanded 400 hours of work per month from his porters, sometimes in stretches of 20 consecutive hours. They were not allowed to travel in the cars they worked in because of Jim Crow racial segregation laws. And their base pay in the 1920s averaged around $810 per year. That's roughly $14,000 in today's money for 400 hours of labor per month, not a week, a month. And the racial humiliation went beyond the wages. White passengers commonly called all the porters George, as in George Pullman, regardless of their actual names. It was a dehumanizing practice that erased their individual identities and reduced them to extensions of their employer. Some porters reportedly had to carry cards to prove their real names were something else. But here's where the story turns. In 1925, a civil rights leader and labor organizer named A. Philip Randolph began the work of unionizing the porters into the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It took 12 years of organizing against one of the most powerful corporations in America, against constant intimidation, racism, and a political system designed to ignore them. But in 1937, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became the first black-led labor union to win a formal contract with a major American corporation. They secured wage increases, capped working hours, and started reducing the porters' total dependence on tips. It was a historic victory. 12 years, and they won. And it mattered far beyond wages. These men traveling the country on trains became major carriers of news, civil rights literature, and organizing information across black communities from coast to coast. Historians have credited the Pullman Porters with directly seeding the infrastructure that powered the civil rights movement decades later. All right, let's talk about how tipping went from a thing people do to a thing the federal government officially makes possible. It's 1938. Franklin Roosevelt signs the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, first federal minimum wage ever, 25 cents an hour, bans child labor, creates the 40-hour work week. By any measure, a genuinely big deal. But, and this is a critical but, the law almost entirely excluded restaurant and hotel workers. Most tipped workers weren't covered. And that exclusion was not a drafting oversight. Southern Democratic congressmen had pushed hard for it because these jobs were disproportionately held by black workers. Economic historians have called these exclusions deliberate racial carve-outs. Finally, in 1966, at the height of the civil rights movement, restaurant and hotel workers get included in the law's protections. Progress, right? Well, sort of. They get included with a catch, a tip credit. The employer only has to pay them half the minimum wage because tips are supposed to fill the other half. That's the moment the tipping system gets formally encoded into American law. Then comes 1996 and a man named Herman Cain. Before his later political career, Cain was CEO of Godfather's Pizza and then president of the National Restaurant Association, the industry's most powerful lobbying group, which critics have nicknamed the Other NRA. He lobbied Congress to decouple the tipped minimum wage from the regular minimum wage. Going forward, they'd move separately. The regular federal minimum wage eventually rose to $7.25. The tipped minimum hit $2.13 in 1991, and it has been $2.13 ever since. Not because nobody noticed, not because Congress forgot, because the lobbying kept it there. The National Restaurant Association has spent decades fighting any change to this number, because as long as tipping exists, their labor costs stay artificially low. Today, 8 states, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, have fully eliminated the tipped minimum wage. Employers must pay all workers the full state minimum, tips or not. And the restaurant industries in those states haven't collapsed. Food is still being served. Businesses are still open. It works. Because even if you just heard everything in the last 14 minutes and found it completely convincing, you are still almost certainly going to tip at your next restaurant. I know I will. And researchers at Cornell University and Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business have studied this for decades and found something fascinating. The amount people tip has only a weak correlation with actual service quality. So what actually drives tipping? 2 things. First, reciprocity. It's a deep human instinct. When someone does something for you, brings food, refills your coffee, checks in on you, there's a psychological pull to give something back. It's the same impulse that makes you bring wine to a dinner party even when the host says just bring yourself. It's almost biological. Second, and this is the big one, social conformity. We tip primarily because not tipping feels like a public violation of a known social norm. Researchers describe the psychological discomfort we feel when we break norms as a kind of disutility. Basically, stiffing a server doesn't just feel cheap, it actually feels bad in a visceral, anxiety-producing way. And we're wired to avoid that feeling, even when we know the whole history. And here's the trap within the trap. As tip expectations crept upward from roughly 10% in the early 1900s to 15% by mid-century to the now standard 20% and beyond, our internal sense of normal just recalibrated with it. We didn't choose 20%, we were nudged there by tip screens, by pre-filled suggested amounts, by social pressure. Psychologists call this norm creep. The baseline moves, we follow. Nobody really notices while it's happening. Now we're in the age of tip fatigue, where tip screens pop up at coffee shops, bakeries, self-checkout kiosks, and some vending machines. A third of Americans say they often feel forced to tip more than they want to. The original system, designed to avoid paying black workers after the Civil War, has mutated into something that makes everyone uncomfortable, that nobody fully designed, and that nobody seems to know how to stop. So here's where we land. Tipping started as a European class ritual. It came to America, got rejected as elitist and un-American, got banned in 7 states, and then got resurrected as a post-Civil War tool for avoiding paying black workers a wage. It spread on Pullman trains, got baked into federal law in 1966, got frozen at $2.13 in 1991 by lobbying, and it's been there ever since. But knowing the real story changes something. This isn't an innocent tradition. It isn't about service quality, the research is clear. It is a specific labor system with specific historical origins, specific winners, and specific people who were hurt building it. And the next time a tip screen rotates toward you and silently judges you between 18%, 20%, and 25%, you'll know exactly how you got there. If this genuinely surprised you, share it with someone who still thinks tipping is just about saying thank you. And if you want the next chapter, specifically how the restaurant lobby has killed every serious attempt at reform over the last 30 years, and the one state where the experiment actually worked, that video is next. Make sure you're subscribed, because that one is even wilder than this.